elements of bread making are flour, water, salt, and yeast. Whether yeast comes from natural sources like the air with these long fermentation times, or you're adding yeast, yeast is generally required for most types of bread products. Today, though, I want to talk about sodium chloride, or salt. So let's talk a little bit about what salt does. Salt delays the hydration of the gluten protein. It enhances the strength and the stability of the gluten. This is very important. It, of course, adds better gas retention properties, adds flavor, and it regulates yeast activity. Now, if you look up here, you can see that with the addition of salt, all of these gluten protein strands are more lined up. They're tighter together. They're more compact, ultimately holding gas much better than a dough without salt in it. And this is the reason why you get that strength and you get that really good leavening from doughs with salt in them. Now, down here you can see that if you don't add salt, your proteins aren't as compact, they're not really lined up quite as well. Your dough ultimately is weaker. CO2 gas has an opportunity with very little trouble to start sneaking away and creating collapse in your product. So salt has a major effect on the strengthening and the alignment of the gluten proteins. So when you don't add salt, there is a yeast party going on there. Very naughty little yeasties. They're just going absolutely crazy. Your bread is rising very fast, and ultimately the structure, the structure of the dough is so weak and sticky and fragile, very prone to collapse. Now, when you add salt, the yeast activity is retarded. So in a way, you're adding salt to control the rate of fermentation and, of course, add flavor, as we talked about. But its main function is conditioning and strengthening of the gluten protein. Now, many people would think that adding salt into your dough affects the yeast directly. That's not true. The effect of salt really, and the reason that the fermentation is slowed, is because the gluten structure is getting tighter, and ultimately it's controlling the rate of expansion and fermentation. So when you look around out there, there's a lot of mixed information. Can salt kill yeast? If you put the two right together, right away, pour your yeast right on top of your salt or vice versa, will it die? Can you kill the yeast? The answer is 100%, of course it can. However, not how you think. Well, how does salt kill yeast? As an example, if you buried yourself in salt, what do you think is going to happen? The answer is eventually you die from dehydration. Salt is hygroscopic. It will pull moisture from whatever it is. The same thing applies to yeast. So if you were left in salt long enough, eventually you would become so dehydrated that you would die. Yeast works exactly the same. So if you covered yourself in salt and you walked around and you decided to clean the house or whatever, and you're covered in salt, you're not going to die. Yeah, your lips might chap a little bit or something like that. You'll have maybe small, minimal little effect because you're covered in salt. Well, the same applies to yeast. Yeast will not automatically start to die immediately coming into contact with salt. It's all about extended periods where the hygroscopic effects of the salt plays a role in destroying the yeast. So do you need to be worried about having your salt with your yeast, or you've made a mistake and you've kind of thrown them all together? The answer is really no. However, general good baking practices, and they still do this in the bakeries, you always keep your salt separate from your yeast. I mean, you don't want to retard it or damage it in any way by, basically throwing them on top of each other and then, running off to answer the phone or something like that. So a good baking practice is that if you're going to put them into your mixing bowl with your flour and everything, always put them to the opposite sides of the bowl. Bakers still do this, even in the commercial baking industry. Generally, they just don't throw it on top for good general baking practices. So let's do some questions and some answers. Can I bake bread without salt? The answer is yes. Generally, it's going to be a stickier, it's going to be a weaker, it's going to be a very bland tasting bread. However, some traditional breads are made without salt, usually accompanied with some very strong type of condiments on the side, like antipesto or olives or these types of things. So yes, you can bake bread without salt, but just be aware it's a very sticky and very weak structure to work with. Can I use no salt substitutes? Well, the answer really is yes and no. You need to take a very close look at what you're actually substituting in there, because salt actually is not just about flavor. As a matter of fact, flavor is the least thing that it offers. The most important part about salt is the conditioning and the strengthening effect that it has on gluten. Some of these salt substitutes do not provide the chemical makeup to create this type of strengthening and conditioning of your gluten. So be very careful with it. So can I reduce the amount of salt that I use? The answer is yes. You can drop it down to around 1% and still retain enough strength in your dough that you should get a decent amount of leavening and the control of the yeast activity and the strength that you need to make a reasonably decent loaf of bread. Now you start dropping down under the 2%. You're going to notice that your product will be stickier, it will be a little bit weaker, so keep all this in mind. But can I reduce the amount of salt? Absolutely. 1% is kind of a bottom line that I would recommend if you want to retain the types of performance characteristics of your dough. I won't get into it too much. So can I replace table salt with kosher or sea salt? The answer is yes. But keep in mind that these different types of salts and the brand of salt can be a factor with respect to the weight. Where your recipe might call for 1 tablespoon or 1 teaspoon or whatever of salt, especially with this imperial system, you might find that a sea salt might weigh a lot less. So it's very important to scale your ingredients using a digital scale versus just relying on teaspoon and tablespoon measurements. So which salt is the best to use? Well, that just depends on who you talk to. Lots of guys swear by sea salt, and there's many different brands and types of sea salt. Others love kosher salt. You can see many people also saying kosher salt is the best salt, this and that. King Arthur Baking, they base most of their recipes on standard table salt. But one thing I will tell you is this, is that if you have the option of using a non-iodized salt, better than using iodized table salt. We're going to get into, and I'm going to talk a lot more about the different types of salts in another video, because it really is important to understand the differences, and especially if you're looking for sodium reduced diets and a little bit more healthier types of options. And I have some really great stuff coming up soon. So, can I add salt to my sponge, poolish, or biga? Well, the answer really simply is yes, but why? Some bakers will add salt into their poolishes or their pre-ferments to control the fermentation process. Usually you have a very specific purpose as to why they would do that. Generally, you don't really want to add salt into these types of pre-ferments because you want that activity to happen rapidly and develop those flavors without retarding or delaying the fermentation process through the addition of salt. Thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you learned a little bit of something out of this one. I always try to give a little bit of information in there that's a little different from some of the other websites. But if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to drop me a line. I'd be happy to answer any of your baking questions. And remember, please give me a like and a subscribe down below. It really, really helps with this YouTube stuff, and especially when you're starting off like I am. So thank you. We'll see you again next time on No BS Baking.